As we start week 4 of Raising Grateful Kids, today my hope is that we can begin to tie together some of the pieces that we've talked about so far. Obviously, we've been talking about entitlement, right? Are you getting to where you don't like that word anymore? I don't like that word anymore, but I see it in my house every single day. And if you have boys, as they get older, they go through this phase of every single thing they say is followed by, "Oh, I'm just kidding, Mom, I'm just joking." And so my 15-year-old, I'm hoping we're nearing the end of that phase because we've been there for a long time. And he likes to, if something happens, he likes to complain and be like, "Oh, Mom, why do I have to do that?" And then he goes, "I'm just kidding." I'm like, "Oh. The last thing I need is you adding, not real complaints, to our lives." And so if you have boys, just, there you go. That's what's coming. But we've been talking about entitlement and how it is both a spiritual problem and a cultural problem, right? And then in week 2, Trisha talked to us about absolute truth and about having a right view of ourselves before God. And then last week we took a little bit of a sidestep, and we talked about technology and how it is affecting our kids and our families. And so if you missed any of those, or you need a refresher, or you just want to go back to any of those talks, remember that they're all on our YouTube channel, Fellowship Women AR. And so if you're feeling like, "Oh, I don't quite have all those pieces in place," go back, check those out, review that information, because today we're going to try to see how it fits together. Because today we're going to talk about what it means to develop hearts of obedience in our children. And we need to recognize that gratefulness and obedience are actually tied together. And maybe you've never thought about that before, so let me explain what I mean. See, entitlement says, "I am in charge. I am the top priority. I am the most important." But for obedience to take place, we can't have that attitude. So entitlement and obedience are directly opposed. And so very tightly tied to this picture of having grateful kids that we're talking about, that means that we also want to have obedient kids, right? Because they really do work together. And so the first step towards obedience is diminishing entitlement. And I use the word diminishing because realistically, we're not going to be able to sweep our hearts and our houses totally clean of entitlement, but we can diminish it. And so we've been addressing that first part of diminishing entitlement. But today I want to move to that second part. How do we develop a heart of obedience? Well, I think that there are 4 very practical steps. And so the first thing that we have to do when we're training obedience is we have to establish authority. When our kids are entitled, they believe that they run the show, that they are the ones who are in charge, and that the rules don't apply to them. Anybody feel that in your house? And so the first step towards obedience is correcting that pattern of thinking. And this requires really 2 things from our kids. First, it requires humility. They have to be taught in a loving way that they don't know everything, that they are not the ones who set all the rules, and that there are people that they should trust and listen to who know more than they do. Right? How many times have you had that conversation maybe when you were growing up with your parents of how many years longer they have been on this earth than you have? Right? Our kids have to recognize that. They have to be humble. And second, establishing authority in the eyes of our kids requires acknowledging a standard of absolute truth. And that's what Trisha talked to us about, absolute truth, a couple of weeks ago. We have to hold to a standard of truth. Otherwise, all rules become relative. They become subjective, and our kids have no reason to obey. Right? Because right and wrong is now only a matter of opinion. If their opinion is different than your opinion, then why do I need to obey you? And it doesn't help that the culture that we live in today is adamant that truth is subjective and tolerance is expected. Right? Why? Why is that? Why are we so set on subjective truth? Why does that feel so right to us at times? Because we mistakenly think that subjective truth means freedom. Freedom to think what you want. Freedom to do what you want. Freedom to be free from the rules and opinions of other people. But here's the reality. Subjective truth feels like it should be freedom, but that's actually a lie. Subjective truth feels like it should be freedom, but that's a lie because it actually leads to guilt and shame and bondage. And Jesus tells us this in John 8, verses 31 and 32. He says, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth." And guess what? The truth will set you free. So practically, how do we establish this authority? Well, first, we have to act like we are the parents and our kids are the kids. And that seems like an obvious statement, but we have to require respect from our kids. We need to give respect to our kids. We teach simple things like manners. We model those manners and kindness to others for our kids. And we begin to have and hold expectations of our children. What does that look like? Well, we allow and enforce consequences. We treat our kids in a consistent, loving way, balancing both grace and expectation. Now, I want you to hear me clearly on this when I say that we need to act like the parent. Because there's a big difference in being a godly authority figure and being a parent who just thrives on the power of being in charge. Some parents operate by that principle of, I'm in charge and you'll do it because I said so. Now, are there times that I have said because I said so? Yes. When you get so tired of answering all the questions of, well, why do I have to do this? Well, why did you tell me to do this? Well, eventually you say because I said so. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're operating by that principle, okay? Because a godly parent holds to these two things that we're talking about, humility and absolute truth. A godly parent holds to those things themselves. They don't just say, do as I say. We have to say, do as I do. Follow me as I follow Christ. And so we model a humble spirit for our kids. We show our kids that we answer to an authority. We're not the ultimate authority. We answer to an authority. And we have to be willing to live in this structure of God being our authority before we can ask our kids to live in the structure of us being their authority. And can you see how when we do that, and when we live in that design that God intended, we're eventually setting them up to answer to God as their authority. We're training them towards authority. We're establishing that authority in their hearts. And so the first step is for us to begin to see ourselves as that God-ordained authority over our kids, rather than just wanting to be their friend and their source of happiness. So once we've begun to establish authority, the next step is to cultivate obedience. Obedience is not just following orders. We tend to think about it like that. But true obedience is really a heart attitude expressed in behavior. It's an attitude of humility that submits to authority. And so I want to share with you this example from Luke 15. It's the story of the prodigal son, and you've probably heard this before. But let's read it, starting in Luke 15, verse 11. There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of property or my inheritance that is coming to me. Give me what I'm due." Okay, a little entitlement there, right? And so the dad did. He divided his property between them because he had 2 sons. And not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had, and he took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his field to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything. And then he came to his senses and he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I'm dying here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven, against God, and against you. And I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. So treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. And while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, and he felt compassion, and he ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven, and I've sinned before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead, and he's alive again. He was lost, and he's found.' And they began to celebrate." Now, you've probably heard that part of the story before, and we do see entitlement in the son's heart, right? And we see that turn because he suffers the consequences. And that entitlement turns to gratefulness, which leads him back to his father and into obedience. And so there's a lot to learn from the prodigal son, but I want to finish the story. It says, "Now the man's older son was in the field. And as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked, 'What do these things mean?' And the servant said to him, 'Your brother has come back. Your father has killed the fattened calf, because he received him back safe and sound.' But that older brother was angry, and he refused to go in to the celebration. And his father came out and he entreated him, but he answered his father, 'Look, these many years I have served you. I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might even celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, when he came, you killed the fattened calf for him.' And the father said to the older son, he said, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It is fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost, and now he's found.'" And so sometimes we look at this story and we see the contrast of a younger son who was rebellious and screwed up, and an older son who stayed at home and did what he was supposed to, and he did things right. Have you kind of been taught that in this story? But really what we see in this story is a disobedient son and an older son who, even though he was doing things right on the outside, even though his behavior was right, his heart was wrong. The attitude of his heart was in the wrong place. And so he was kind of like the little boy. You've probably heard the fictional story about the little boy who his mom kept telling him to sit down in this chair, sit down, sit down, sit down. And when he finally complied, he looked at her and he said, "I may be sitting down on the outside, but I am standing up on the inside." Have you ever been there with your kids? That's not the obedience that we're looking for. I mean, it's a start, but true and complete obedience includes having the right heart attitude. True obedience matches up the outside with the right heart. And so how do we develop this in our kids? Well, we use the process that we've talked about before in Bloom for Discipline. Teach, train, correct. Teach, train, correct. First, we teach our kids what an obedient heart looks like and how it behaves. That's not something that they automatically know and that they automatically default to. We have to teach them. We have to model them, tell them, begin to build their understanding of what we expect from them. Secondly, we train them. We remind them of what we want. We remind them of what we expect. We give them a chance to learn and practice those behaviors. And then when they have a good understanding of what it means to truly obey, we begin to correct them when their heart and or their behavior requires it. And so when our children are younger, a lot of times we have to step in and create consequences, right? Because they don't necessarily connect the dots of their actions. Or if we allowed them to suffer the natural consequence of their actions, it would harm them or it would be dangerous for them. But as our kids get older, many times all we have to do is stay out of the way and let the consequences of their actions naturally play out. And that's what we see with the prodigal son. The dad said, okay, you're old enough. I'm going to let you do this and see how it turns out. And so it's important that the result of choices and behaviors, both positive and negative, it's important that those results land on our kids so that they learn how to deal with the results. When they exhibit a positive behavior and the right heart, then they receive the fruits of that. They reap the benefits of that. They learn to be proud of themselves. They learn to repeat that behavior. And even when they fail, as long as they're trying, they learn how to adapt and they learn how to do things differently next time. But if they never learn these skills, then when they hit difficulties in the future, they just disintegrate because they don't know how to handle it. When they fail or when they make a mistake, it's like the world is ending because they've never had to work through that before. They never connect the dots between their choices and the outcome of those choices. And so they say things like, well, I couldn't help it, or it's not my fault, or they blame other people. They refuse to take responsibility. And so allowing the natural consequences to land on our kids actually helps to teach them problem solving and to teach them critical thinking skills. But this is hard sometimes, right? It's hard to let your child suffer the consequences of their choices. But we have to do it now when our kids are still in our home, when the stakes are small. Because when they leave our home, the consequences become bigger and more hurtful and longer lasting. And we send them out and they're really ill-equipped to survive the real world. And so finally, as we're cultivating and developing obedience in our kids, we also need to remember that true obedience should bring joy. It should bring joy. When we obey, when we do things the way God designed them to, we should feel joy in our hearts and in our lives and in our families. So you can train this in your children. You can use rewards to help them understand that positive choices have a positive outcome that makes them happy. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you don't confuse rewards with bribes. Now let's talk about that for a second. A reward is something that's set up in advance, and rewards or encourages right choices. Okay, a bribe on the other hand, is a bargaining chip thrown out in the heat of the moment to try to regain control over that situation. Okay, for example, if you're going into Target and before you get out of the car, you say to your kids, if you guys can be in the cart and you can wait patiently and not whine and complain, then at the end, we'll get to pick a small toy or some gum or whatever it is, a small reward. That is setting up a reward. However, if you are in the middle of Target and your kids are acting like complete fools and embarrassing you and whining and complaining and pitching a fit, and you say, if you guys will stop right now, then I'll buy you a toy, that's a bribe. See the difference? Rewards teach your kids how their positive behavior brings a positive consequence. The only thing that bribes serve to teach is the art of manipulation. So rewards, when used appropriately, can help you connect obedience with joy in the heart of your child. You can train and cultivate the joy of obedience. And so the third step, we've established authority. We're working to cultivate obedience, and both of those are ongoing processes. The next and really important step is for you to expect obstacles. First, you need to know that your kids are not going to like discipline. They're not going to like being told no. We don't like that, right? If I enjoyed discipline, then I would get up at 5:30 every morning and I would work out for an hour and I would do all of these things and my house would look perfect. And let me tell you, it doesn't. It doesn't happen because I don't enjoy discipline, right? And your kids aren't going to enjoy discipline. When you correct them or you tell them no, they're not just going to say, oh, okay, Mommy, you're right. That's a bad decision. I won't do that. They're not going to do that. That's not how it works. And so if you can know and remind yourself ahead of time, hey, my kids are going to react in a way that is not good because they're not going to like what I'm about to tell them. If you can know that ahead of time and expect it, it's a lot easier to keep going through that, to press through, to stay the course, and to pursue obedience. Next, don't rescue your child. This is super hard, especially in our culture today that says your kids should do things perfectly. They should be straight A students. They should be the best athletes. They should have the best opportunity. They should have the right clothes. They should have all of these things. Don't rescue your child. You must allow those natural consequences to land on your kids. You can empathize with them. You can encourage problem solving, but don't step in and rescue. Don't step in and do it for them. And then refuse to say, I told you so. When they say that they don't want to wear a jacket this morning and it's 45 degrees outside, and then you get outside and they're cold, it doesn't help teach the lesson if you say, well, I told you should have worn your jacket, and if you had, you wouldn't be cold. I have to bite my tongue to keep myself from emphasizing the lesson, right? But don't do that. Let the consequences be the teacher. Don't step in the middle of that process. You can say things like, wow, that must have been really hard to tell your teacher that you forgot your homework. And you can talk it through with them. Or you can say, what's your plan for getting your project done that's due on Friday? But that gives your child responsibility. That helps them learn from the situation with you being kind of outside of the situation and not having to be the bad guy. I've always given my kids one pass a semester at school. I'll bring you your lunch or your homework one time this semester. Because there's always times we forget things, right? And I like for them to see that, hey, we can have each other's backs, but not if this becomes a pattern. I remember I had all 3 kids at the same school, in elementary school, for about 2 years. And I found myself in the office taking somebody's lunch, I think it probably was. And I had told the secretaries, I said, look, each of my kids gets 1 time. If you see me up here repeatedly, just tell me, turn around, and go home. Okay? And so I walk into the office one day, and I set this lunch on the table, and I said, I have Annie's lunch. And here's the secretary. She looks up at me, and she goes. And I said, I've already been here for her, right? And she goes, mm-hmm. I said, okay. It's kind of hard to keep track, if you got 3 kids and who have I been here and who have I not, but she held me accountable for that because she knew that that's what was best for that child. They weren't going to let her starve, but she was going to remember to get her lunch next time. Let consequences happen. Your child will learn best by their failures rather than by you doing it for them. A great rule of thumb that I remind myself of sometimes is if you are finding that you are doing everything for your kids and they're not doing for themselves, and you're getting frustrated that they are not taking responsibility for things, check yourself, because it probably means that they don't have to, because you're coming behind them and doing it for them. You're always rescuing them. They haven't had to suffer the consequences. So finally, focus on the long game. Don't get discouraged by the short-term obstacles of your kids' reactions, of their failures. Focus on the long-term heart of your child and stay the course. See, Satan wants you to feel like a failure. He wants you to feel like it's too late. You should have started when they were this big, and now they're this big, and it's too late. He wants you to feel like you're doing it wrong. When your kid gets upset at the consequence that you let him suffer, you shouldn't have done that. If you had stepped in, you wouldn't be having to deal with this reaction. He wants you to feel like you're doing it wrong. And then he wants you to feel like it's just too hard. And those are lies that we've got to recognize and we've got to overcome, because God tells us that it's never too late. In Lamentations 3:22 and 23, he says, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end because they are new every morning. And so I just want to encourage you, when you have that day where you feel like you have screwed every single thing up that you possibly could, I've told you guys before, we came home one day and I had one kid running the house crying and I had the other kid walking up the hill to find a new family. Like, for real. If you haven't been there, you will be. But on those days, I want to encourage you, God's mercies never end. They're new every morning. It's never too late. It's never too late. And so as we're diligent to do these things, to establish authority, to cultivate obedience, to expect and overcome those obstacles, then we make it to the 4th step, which is to reap the rewards of resilience in your kids, of respect in your kids, and responsibility. Galatians 6:9 encourages us, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. And that's so true, even in our parenting. It takes a while to see it. It takes a while, but I promise if you will put in the work to establish authority and cultivate obedience in your kids and in their hearts, you will reap the rewards. Let me pray for us, and you guys can head off to your small groups. God, thank you for your word and for your principles, God. I thank you that regardless of where we stand with you, regardless of what our belief is in you, your principles work, God, because that's the way you've designed our hearts. That's the way you've wired us. that's the way you intended things to be. And so, God, I pray that you would use your principles to draw us closer to you, to tie our hearts more tightly to yours, God. Would you focus our hearts on gratefulness, knowing that it is tied to our obedience? Would you help us see how those two things are manifest in our kids, God? God, I pray that you give us the courage to be the authority that you've created us to be in our homes. That we would first submit to you as our authority and model that for our kids. God, we love you and praise you. We just give you our families, and we ask that you would pour out your mercies on us new every morning, God. That as we get to the end of the day, that we would be reminded that your love never ceases, God. And that if we are faithful to invest in our families, to parent as godly authorities, that we will reap your rewards, God. So we ask that in our lives. We love you and praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.